The Different Kingdom Ages, Section 2. The Old Kingdom. Now, as you know, um, I had to have an old lady on there. She looks like an OG, I gotta say. All right, so the Old Kingdom. This section's all about kind of like the time periods, and we're going to talk about the religion. So the Old Kingdom refers to the first great period of unity, especially after the guy named Mayonnaise, Pharaoh Mayonnaise. Remember when he conquered everyone? He's like, "Yeah, your mom, what, fool, what?" And he conquered everybody. Well, the Old Kingdom was the first unified period in ancient Egypt. There's a lot of history there. In this time period, we get the Great Pyramids of Giza, okay, which we're going to talk about the next slide. But just know that these pyramids were essentially cemeteries. They were elaborate tombs that, oh, excuse me, they were elaborate tombs that you literally buried dead people in. Excuse me. So it'd be pretty epic if you guys, when I pass away, build a tomb for me. I want a large pyramid, but we'll talk about that next slide. But anyway, we're going to talk about that. But just remember, the Old Kingdom is all about the first period. What period? First period of Egyptian unity. All right. So another important thing we have to discuss is something called Egyptian society. Every country, every area has some sort of society. America has a society. We have the upper class, we have the middle class, we have the lower class, and that's really generally where our society falls in line. But in ancient Egypt, it was a lot different. In ancient Egypt, you have what you call a hierarchy. And a hierarchy is essentially something where the class is broken up by hierarchy. There's like a ladder, there's a step ladder. And at the top of that ladder, you have a pharaoh. Remember, we talked about the pharaoh before. The pharaoh was someone that kind of ruled the country. However, he also led all the religious rituals. He was considered a god. After them, you had the nobles and the priests. The nobles owned land while the priests worked in the temples. And Egyptian society was built upon its religion. So everything in society was essentially religious. Then you would have government officials and scribes, or how Avery will say it, scribes. You have these individuals as well, and they kind of rule the government. This is where you get your visors. This is where you get your lawmakers and those type of people. All right, and then the scribes would write things down. Then you have craftsmen. That should be together. Should be together. Then you have craftsmen, and craftsmen make things with their hands. And from craftsmen, you get merchants where they sell those things, and those people get rich. And then also you have farmers. Farmers would farm on what river? The Nile River. Farmers would farm on the Nile River, and they would make sure they grow crops, and they would give it to the merchants. The merchants would sell it, so on and so forth. However, you also had another class of people called not women. Yes, women. But we're supposed to be slaves if they're farmers, not women. Let me go back real quick. Oops. So then you also have slaves under farmers, but then you also have women. Now, in most ancient societies, how women worked was women were considered the property of the husband. They were often not allowed in society without their husband with them. In Egypt, it was a lot different. In Egypt, women could own property. Women could actually go and even rule an area. They could govern. Now, it was a little more difficult than it was for men, but in regards to ancient civilization, women had a lot more rights and freedom in Egyptian society than in most all other societies in ancient society, in the ancient world. Oh my goodness, I'm repeating myself. So, in a nutshell, this is really what ancient society is in Egypt. This is how it's broken down. So Egyptian gods are really important in society, especially in Egypt. Remember, I said that in the last slide where Egypt was essentially a nation ran by religion. It was all religious focused. And there are 1,500 gods. It was what we would call polytheism, where there's many different gods and each god has a function. Well, I'm only going to talk about a couple of them. One of the major gods is this guy is Ra, and later he becomes known as Amun-Ra. Now he is the god of the universe. He controls all of destinies. He becomes very significant. He becomes the chief god. He also is the god of the sun. And if you think about it, what do you need to plant crops? You need sunlight.
and Egypt is a very bright place. So it was very important for the pharaohs and the people to please Ra, because if not, they might get destroyed. This guy was Anubis. And I know these pictures are really cool. I don't know if that's kind of what they looked like if you look at the hieroglyphics, but that's all old stuff. So let's go with the new, out with the old, in with the new. Anubis was the god of death. What I mean by death is that when a person would die, they would go to Anubis, and Anubis would take their heart, right, their little heart, and he would weigh it on a scale. And the scale, on the other side of the scale, he would put the feather right here. And if the feather was heavier than the heart, that person would go into the afterlife. If not, they would essentially be destroyed. The other god is, we talked about him, named Osiris. Osiris was the god of the underworld, and I mentioned a really cool story of Osiris. He had this brother named named Set, and Set killed his brother and chopped him up in all these little pieces and spread them all the corners of the globe. However, his sister, who was also his wife or his lover, found his bodies and found all the pieces of his bodies, went all to the corners, resurrected him, and then he became the god of the underworld. And so he was also very important in society. But remember, the Egyptians' gods also are very tied to the idea of mummification. Remember, mummification was when an important individual, especially in the pyramids, died, they would get encased in a tomb. And in that tomb, they would have their treasures, they'd have their wealth, they'd have their riches, and after they passed, if they passed the judgment of Anubis, they would go to the afterlife where they could live and bring the stuff that they left behind. Now, this is a great mummy, but what about this dude? This is what most mummies look like when you open up their tomb. But if that kind of freaks you out, because that dude is really kind of ugly. Oh, I mean, he's been probably dead for thousands of years. But you can always look at this. There's a mummy for you. So anyway, that is essentially the Egyptian gods. Now we've covered a lot so far. We've covered the Old Kingdom, they built all the pyramids, and the pyramids were essentially tombs. However, there was also something called the Middle Kingdom, and this is a great map for that. If you look at it, the yellow is actually the Old Kingdom, but during that time, the pyramids took a lot of money. The pharaohs got really powerful, and some things started happening in the Old Kingdom where there started to be famines. Remember, a famine is like a disaster. People were starving, crops weren't growing, and since the pharaohs were tied to the gods, the people turned on the pharaohs, and so chaos began to happen. People began to rebel and fight each other. However, someone rose up from that, and that person was this guy named Mentuhotep II. And what he did was he reunified the north and the southern, upper and lower Egypt. So he reunified upper and lower Egypt, and what he ended up doing was he did some great things after that. He not only reunified them, he began to make them more stronger. Well, he kind of upgraded it a little bit. He upgraded the military. He began to conquer areas. If you see, everything in like orange is actually part of the Middle Kingdom. So it's the yellow and the orange, and later on the New Kingdom comes around. But we'll talk about that a little later. So as you see, he didn't only find areas inside around the Nile, but he also began to get into oases. And an oasis is a place in the middle of the desert where there's water. And then so cities would be built around oases sometimes. So the Middle Kingdom was another time of prosperity for ancient Egypt. All right. However, that is not always to last. So once again, the Middle Kingdom is great, and they also have trade routes. He trades all through Egypt, all through Nubia, but he also goes into the Red Sea, trades with these areas over here. The Middle Kingdom does a lot of things to grow. All right, but something bad happens in the Middle Kingdom, and then that is the end of the Middle Kingdom. I want to say like Middle Earth, but I guess I can't. So I just left off where the Middle Kingdom begins to have an issue, and the issue comes with these people here. These people are called the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos, they were pretty hardcore. They looked at Egypt and they noticed something. You know, they're traveling the land, they're kind of migrating here and there, and they're like, wow, wait a second. Hang on. That place over there, they got a lot of wealth. They got a lot of money. And that place is pretty cool. So what they do is they invade. And now, the Middle Kingdom, wait a second, didn't the Middle Kingdom have a good army? Well, they did, but the Hyksos had better technology. They had better weapons, but they also had this thing right here called the chariot. The chariot was like an ancient tank. On the back of the tank, on the back of the chariot, you would have you'd have an archer, you would have spear throwers, you would have these individuals. But the thing is that they were also fast. They could travel around your infantry and just take out a whole bunch of people. And if you have a whole bunch of chariots, you could almost annihilate any army on foot. Like, it was pretty ridiculous and unfair. All right. But anyway, so the Hyksos conquered Egypt. But unlike a lot of conquerors, they didn't change it. They loved Egypt. They loved the religion. They're like, wow, this is pretty cool. We can get pretty wealthy off this. They loved the people. They loved when they became pharaohs to be known as, hey, I'm a pharaoh. Haha, I'm a god. You know, they enjoyed that. And they ruled for over 100 years. So the reason why they were able to last that long is because of their great military technology. But even though they tried to become like the Egyptians hated them. And eventually, after 100 years, the Egyptians rose up, conquered them with their own technology, and then took it back over. And that is where you get to the start of the New Age. But the guy that led the rebellion was this handsome fellow right here named Akhmos. Very handsome. No nose, I know. So that is the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom. In the next section, we were going to talk about this individual named Hatshepsut, who is a lady female. Lady female? Yep, makes sense. Lady Pharaoh. So, and that is Miss Bosco. So, here we go.